I can't resist having my first thing to look at the title of the session: Race, Religion, and the Global Community. And one can use thinking about the title as an introduction to the American presidential race of 2008. There's one term that is not in that title, that would have been there if things had happened differently. And there is one term that is there that would not have been there if things had happened differently in the primaries. If Hillary Clinton had won the Democratic nomination, then we would be talking about gender, religion, and the global economy, rather than race, religion, and the global economy. And I think that that gives us one important feature, at least from my experience, one important feature of the 2008 presidential election in the United States. It seems to me that if Hillary Clinton had been running against just simply a bunch of white men, then gender would have been a real issue, a highly visible issue. Or if Obama had been running simply against a bunch of white men, race would have been a dominant issue. But having the two leading candidates for the Democratic nomination emerge, each of them being an historic kind of figure, meant that what could have become a very divisive, either racially or genderly election, I think was assisted by the fact that the first possible African American or first possible black to be a presidential nominee and the first really realistic woman to be a nominee were running against each other. And so one of the really remarkable things, as you look at the interviews and so on, is looking at the countervailing pressures of prejudice as they developed during the primary and now, as you get looking at the white male miners of West Virginia. These are very chauvinist people, male chauvinist people. But when push came to shove in the West Virginia primary, they all came out and voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, if 4 years ago you would have told those men that they were going to be voting for a woman for president in the primary, they would probably have said, "You're off your rocker." But you had balancing prejudices, because in other areas you had people who would vote for, who voted for Obama, even though they might never, under other circumstances, have voted for a person of color. And so I think that the title itself kind of points, the title of our session points to one of the important facts about the election, is that yes, it's a historic election, but it's a very interestingly historic election because of the character of the contests that developed. Now, the final thing as my introductory, lifting off of the title, is that the global economy, or the crisis of the global economy, is there in the title. And for a long time after the nominations, race was an interesting and important part of the election. Religion was an interesting and important part of the election. There were controversial clergymen who had endorsed each of the candidates, an extremist, racist, fundamentalist preacher had endorsed McCain, and an extremist African-American gospel preacher had supported and had been the pastor of Obama. And so these were the kind of issues that were out there, and quite frankly, the global economic crisis has trumped all of the other issues. And I think that this becomes, again, the aspect that we need to think about as we now look, and as I'm going to turn more closely to the issue of religion. Religion could have been an issue, but it got trumped by the global economy. And so I think that as we look, the first question in a country, in a community like Malaysia, it strikes me that the first question is probably, that is of most interest to you, is what about the basically anti-Islamic prejudice that is reflected in the reports that people think that Obama is a Muslim, and not only that they think that he's a Muslim, but they think that it's a bad thing. And you get varying figures as to how many people in the United States still think that Barack Obama is a Muslim. Let me use the full polemical phrase, or nice phrase, actually, it's a good name, but Barack Hussein Obama still think that he is a Muslim. But basically this issue, I think, needs to be put into some interesting perspectives. The relationship between the average American and the Muslim world is very often a relationship that has at least 2 or 3 spaces between the person and the Muslim world reality. There's at least the one space, which is the space of the television commentator or the newspaper person. And so that most people in the United States have very little direct experience within Muslim majority societies. And so that their knowledge comes either from textbooks, which are improving, or from the broad cultural heritage of interaction between Islamic civilization and Western civilization. Most cultures tend to have reservations about peoples and cultures that are different from them. And again, you have this experience then of Muslims, as they in the world become more visible, can be seen by the average person in the United States as being somehow different, and therefore either to be feared or to be separated from, and so on. And so we start with some negative foundations. But I think as we look at the 2008 election, as we look at where the United States is right now, there are 2 things that I want to mention, and I'm happy to talk as much or as little as you want later on in discussion. There are 2 new elements that have taken place in the United States, that have come into being in the United States, that shape what is the attitude now, and the growing resources now. Let me start with the one that will surprise you, because I will say that this is an element that has improved the situation. And that element is the aftermath of the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11. Now, very often, especially, I've found very often, especially in Muslim majority countries, what people are most aware of is the very negative and hostile response. The destruction of the World Trade Center created a lot of fear among many Americans, and it created a very strong sentiment of mistrust and fear about any Muslim. And so you have substantial stories about harassment of Muhajiba women. You have substantial numbers of stories about vandals doing damage to mosques and things like that. And that happened. But I would like to also point out that my experience has been really interestingly different. I'm at something called the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And that center was in existence for almost 10 years, even before 9/11 in 2001. And part of our center's work was always developing contexts in which there could be constructive Muslim-Christian dialogue, in which Muslims and Christians could get together either in international conferences or in local American parishes or whatever. I think one of the most important things in the history of Muslims in the United States is that there has been a gradual evolution of the nature of the community of Muslims, communities of Muslims in the United States. That now, increasingly, most Muslims that come from immigrant families are third and fourth generation. They are Americans in terms of their language, in terms of their accent, in terms of their culture, and while they may love the fancy meals of their grandmother, they don't necessarily want their grandmother and grandfather to tell them how they should live their lives in suburban Chicago. And so you have the emergence of Muslim Americans as opposed to Muslims living in America. You have the emergence of Muslim Americans who can, in fact, represent their faith in the way that Muslims need to present the faith to Americans, in the same way that Islam has always been able to present itself within the idiom of the cultures where it comes from and where it goes to. And so within that framework then, I think part of the difficulty then with Barack Hussein Obama is that many Americans are aware that there are lots of Muslims who are Americans. And so it's credible that Barack Hussein Obama would be a Muslim. And so you start with, it is a little bit of credibility, but what you have is the second thing, that it's credible that he could be a Muslim, but it is also because people know the Muslim communities. It is also something that for many of them is not a frightening thing. I think probably the single most important statement about Islam in America in relationship to the 2008 election is the statement by the former Secretary of State Colin Powell a couple of weeks ago, when there had been people at political rallies who had said essentially they couldn't support Obama because he was an Arab, which of course was really nonsense, but he was an Arab, or that he was a Muslim or something like that. And Colin Powell said that he had heard that, and then he had heard responses that he did not think were adequate, because he said that the real answer is, so what? So what? If somebody is a Muslim who has been nominated by his party, so what? But Obama is not, of course, a Muslim. And so that it raises then the broader issue of who can be elected president of the United States. And I think that in terms of this kind of presidential election, I'm a historian, so I will give you an old history lesson as well. And that is that back in the days when the Constitution of the United States was being debated in the early republic in 1789 and 1790 in order